Okay, I think we're ready to get underway now. If people could please take their seats for the side event. I'd like to welcome distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, and our online audience tonight for a very special presentation on why low POPs content levels matter. And this particular side event is hosted by IPEN, the International Pollutants Elimination Network. We're talking about why low POPs content levels matter because of their strong relationship to contamination issues related to POPs in waste, and that will be explained further by our group of speakers here tonight. I would just like to introduce them. We're starting at the right of the panel with Mr. Jindrik Pedelik from Arnica. He's also from the Toxics and Waste Program, as well as the IPEN expert on dioxins and POPs waste from Prague in the Czech Republic. And Jindrik will be talking about an introduction and results of a recent study submitted to Environment International on brominated dioxins in toys and consumer products. To my right, we have Mrs. Farida Amotova from Antigen LLP Scientific and Production Enterprise of Almaty in Kazakhstan, discussing the transfer of persistent organic pollutants to food of animal origin. To my left, we have Mr. Roland Weber from the International Panel on Chemical Pollution, the IPCP, an independent consultant on POPs from Germany, and he will be talking about the results of a global review of dioxins and PCBs in eggs. And finally, we have, to my far left, Mr. Serge Molly Alo from the Rotterdam Convention COP10 President, Minamata Convention COP1 and COP2 Vice President, and representing the regional centre from Dakar, the CRCB AF. So without any further delay, I'd like to pass the floor to Jindrik to introduce the first topic. And I didn't introduce myself, and my name is Lee Bell. I'm the Mercury and POPs Policy Advisor from IPEN. And on that note, I'd like to hand over to Jindrik. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the introduction, Lee. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I will try first to introduce you to the topic briefly. We talk about low POPs content levels. It relates definitely to the POPs waste, and one of most critical POPs waste is waste incineration fly ash. When we did a study in 2017, we found out that incineration fly ash is unfortunately suggested for recycling or further use for roads and sidewalks, construction products, cover layers at municipal landfills, but also for embankments or even as amendment in agriculture. Recently, I found that suggestion, for example, for bottom ash from waste incinerators in Gabon. Another concern we have with regards to recycling of POPs is reuse of plastics which contain high levels of brominated flame retardants, in particular polybrominated diphenyl ethers, which are used into new consumer products, and I will talk about results of this recycling of POPs later on, when I will introduce you to a new study which we have done. It stopped working. When we talk about setting low POPs content levels, they can be set up in two different ways. It depends on criterion. If you set up enough strict low POPs content level, you declare the waste containing high volumes of POPs as a waste, in some way hazardous waste, according Stockholm Convention. But if you decide to declare a strict level, you still have a lot of POPs in the waste, but you declare it in some way as a clean waste, which can be moved across the borders, and it has many further consequences. I will talk about these consequences when we try to look at the amount of dioxins left without control by using currently suggested high level for whole POPs content for dioxin, which is 15 ppb. We found out that the amount of dioxins which gets out of the control are more than 7 kilograms dioxins per year, which in fact is level equal to tolerable intake for 133 entire planet's Earth. I mean, for population on 133 planet's Earth. This is definitely something which fits into the new finding that pollution and waste breached the planetary boundaries, which is one of recent findings from last year, I believe. We also sometimes hear that dioxins are old bodies which we don't have to care too much anymore, that it was solved by filters for waste incinerators and some other industries. But Roland Weber will talk about the study which we have done on the levels of dioxins and dioxin-like PCBs in free-range chicken eggs, and based on that, we can say that dioxin pollution is definitely not a thing of the past. Another consequence of not very strict levels for control of POPs is that electronic waste gets, or part of electronic waste in plastics gets to the children in the toys. And some of recent studies look at the pathway of exposure to BFRs in these wastes by mouthing behavior in children. This is one of these studies, and in another study, which was in fact a predecessing study for the one which I will introduce you more, is this one from 2020, which found that by mouthing of some of the toys produced from recycled electronic plastics can reach the level which is 9 times higher than the recommended tolerable daily intake for dioxins. We talk about brominated dioxins in this case, because brominated dioxins are already in brominated flame retardants used in plastics. We looked at this issue more closely and in more broader scale this year, and submitted a new study on that topic to Environment International, and it's under review process now. And in fact, that study looked at the products obtained from 26 different countries from 4 continents, and measured not only levels of brominated dioxins, but also the levels of the dioxin-like activity, and as well as thyroid hormone activity of these toys. And here are the results of our study. We found out that more than 60% of analyzed products from these 26 countries contained brominated dioxin levels above 1 nanogram TEQ per gram, which, if you look into the general technical guidelines, is one of the suggested levels for low POPs content level. So, in fact, children play with something which can be declared hazardous or POPs waste. The highest levels found in toys and other consumer products were up to 17,000 picograms BEQ per gram if it was measured by the DRK-Lux dioxin-like activity on human cells, and it reached almost 14,000 picograms WHO TEQ per gram measured by GC IRS mass spectrometry in German laboratory. We also looked at the thyroid activity by, again, the K-Lux method, and found out that some of these products reached the level up to 410 milligrams per kilo, and measured by chemical analysis, even more, twice as much was the maximum. So it's not only about getting the dioxins together with flame retardants, but also flame retardants which might end up on the list of the Stockholm Convention sometimes, and which definitely harm human health. This is summary of the results. What you can see, the red dots are dioxin-like activities measured by the DRK-Lux in biodetection systems in Netherlands, and blue dots are results of instrumental analysis for brominated dioxins. DRK-Lux dioxin-like activity was definitely caused mainly by brominated dioxins in these products, because we measured also chlorinated dioxins in some of them, and the levels were low. This study had further evidence that current limit for both trace contamination and the definition of POPs weight, it means low POPs content level, which are currently set in the EU POPs regulation, are not enough strict to protect human health. So this limit is 500 milligrams per kilogram, and when we look at the levels related to this level of brominated diphenyl ethers, the brominated dioxins were very high, even in the products with levels about 100 milligrams per kilogram. So, in order to prevent the harm caused by dioxin activity of the products, we need much more strict limit value, and this is one of the reasons why IPEN suggests lower levels, 50 milligrams per kilogram. As I mentioned, major exposure way for children is mouthing by toddlers. These are examples of some products which we analyzed. This is example of a toy car from Kenya, where we found high levels of dioxin-like activity, as well as high levels of brominated dioxins measured by GCMS method. even much higher dioxin-like activity was measured in this story from Czech Republic with typical mole, which is very popular for children in our country. And again, this story contained very high levels. We looked also at kitchen utensils, in which the levels were slightly lower, but still quite high. This is example of the noodle scoop from Tanzania. And you can see that still it reached hundreds of picograms of TEQ per gram levels, either in dioxin-like activity or in results from instrumental measurements. So if we compare the results with measurements of brominated dioxins in other environmental compartments, we found out that it is comparable, like children would play instead of toys with waste incineration ash. It's definitely comparable levels to what was found in waste incineration ashes when it relates to brominated dioxins. We definitely, when we look at the approach to setting the low POPs content levels, we see missing evaluation of costs caused by health damage or loss of IQ in consultancy studies, even in consultancy study, which was very large and done for European Commission. It mainly focused on additional costs for special treatment of waste, but definitely didn't look at the costs which might be caused by inaction. So it means by not setting enough strict levels for low POPs content. And based on all these studies and many other scientific data, we suggest these levels to be approved by this COP. So I think I don't have to read them. You can find them in fact sheets which are available on IPEN booth, and we are glad to say that these levels are in agreement with the proposal by African region, which is available also among the documents uploaded on the convention website. I can thank you at this moment and pass the floor to my colleague Farida Amutua.
I'll just say a brief introduction, as many of you have come into the room after we started. Just to introduce Mrs. Farida Amutova from Antigen LLP Scientific and Production Enterprise of Almaty, Kazakhstan, talking about the transfer of POPs to food of animal origin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Today, my name is Farida. I'm a PhD in agricultural science and head of the Laboratory of Physical and Chemical Methods of Research. And I'm from Kazakhstan, Almaty. And today, with my colleagues from Czech Republic, from Arnica Association, I would like to present you one of my recent study based on meta-analysis. It's a transfer of persistent organic pollutants in food of animal origin. So first thing first, and persistent organic pollutants, it's a toxic compounds which are highly toxic, and most of them are tetragenic, mutagenic, and cancerogenic. And also they have a very high stability in the nature, especially in environmental media, in the soil, because soil has reached by soil organic matter, and therefore it can bind and strongly attach POPs. POPs are easily bioaccumulated because they're lipophilic and they're able to bioaccumulate in lipid tissues, for example, in meat tissues, in eggs and milk. And therefore, they're everywhere. They're widely spread in environment and can easily pass and can easily pass through the food chains. For example, they can deposit it in the soil for a long time, then vegetation can uptake it. Livestock animals can bioaccumulate pollutants by consuming this contaminated vegetation, and so on. And according to the Stockholm Convention, there are generally 3 groups of POPs. The first group, it's agrochemicals or pesticides, among them DDT, aldrin, dieldrin, chlordicon, hexachlorbenzene. The second group, it's industrial chemicals. It's polychlorinated biphenyls, hexachlorobenzene, brominated compounds. The third group is unintentionally generated byproducts. Most of them are dioxin furans, the most toxic cancerogens among all POPs. So, some families of POPs, such as dioxin furans, polychlorinated biphenyls, and pesticides, can be stored very long periods in soil. And in the contamination scenario, soil acts not only as a source of contamination. Soil can be the very powerful reservoir of POPs. And for example, when we're speaking about livestock farms, all free-range food-producing animals, such as dairy cows, goats, and chicken, on a daily basis can consume soil together with the vegetation, can consume soil in different proportions. And therefore, soil can act as a transfer vector of POPs to animals, to livestock animals, and therefore in the food they produced. For example, on this slide, you can see livestock daily soil ingestion data, which I derived from the literature. Looking on the slide, we can see that, for example, dairy cows and sheep can ingest up to 1 kilo dry matter soil per day, especially in the winter period and also during wet autumn periods. Moreover, laying hens are also capable consume soil daily. For example, in unbalanced feeding, laying hens can consume up to 23% of soil per day. So the main aim of this study was to estimate the transfer of POPs to interfood of animal origin using the summarizing published knowledge of POPs transfer by meta-analysis. So we gathered transfer data of POPs, which published over the last 25 years. And these outcomes could be used to assess the risk and, if necessary, to manage using some remediation strategies to limit this transfer. So we created a database which involved 41 peer-reviewed articles. These articles reported transfer data about different families of POPs, such as dioxin furans, pesticides, and polychlorinated biphenyls, to different food of animal origin, such as, for example, milk, eggs, edible tissues, such as liver, fat, and adipose tissue. And some of these articles reported transfer, which was conducted, reported transfer data which was gathered in a field condition. And some of this article, most of them, reported transfer data which occurred in under control conditions when animals exposed daily with a given pollutant dose in a given exposure period. And to estimate transfer, we use 2 scientific concepts. The first concept, it's a transfer rate. This concept estimates transfer only for excreted products like milk and eggs. The second concept was a bioconcentration factor, which were used only for estimation to excreted products. And you can see here the equations of these 2 concepts. Bioconcentration factor, for example, it's a ratio between concentration of pollutant in tissue to pollutant in intake matter in a feed or in contaminated soil. So here on the slide, you can see the results of transfer rate of dioxin furans and PCBs to milk indicated with a green color and to eggs indicated by blue color. Most of the studied compounds transferable in both food products in a notable manner. And unfortunately, the most toxic congeners, such as tetradioxin, pentadioxin, pentafuram, show extremely highly transfer to both food products, with up to 40%. Moreover, chlorinated biphenyls are also extremely highly transferable in these products, with up to 50% for congeners marked with the red triangles. This is another slide with the results of mean bioconcentration factors for dioxin furans, pesticides, PCBs to liver, fat, and muscle tissues. Here we can observe that there is a tissue hierarchy on the left side inside each POPs families. And liver is always highly bioaccumulate pollutants than other tissues. For example, in this slide, in these results, we divided our bioconcentration factors into two categories of animals: animals with a stable body weight or milk eggs produced excreted animals. And on the second side, we can see rapidly growing animals or meat producing animals. And results showed that animals with a stable body weight bioaccumulate pollutants in much higher extent than rapidly growing animals. Especially, for example, if we compare laying hens on the left side to broilers on the right side. We can see this difference visually can be seen in 2 or 3 times difference. And in conclusion, the most toxic POPs from tetra to hexachlorinated dioxin and furans, highly chlorinated PCBs, especially congener 126, as well as DDT, are generally highly transferred to food-producing animals, such as dairy goats, dairy cows, and chicken, when these animals are raised in contaminated soils. And these meta-analyses show that specific techniques, such as transfer rate and bioconcentration factors, allow to quantify and ranking the risk, focusing on food safety. And in perspectives, I would like to also mention and remember you that literature published data reported about daily consumption of soil, and in contaminated scenario on the livestock farms, soil should be considered as the main POPs carrier. Because most of the time in classical contamination scenarios, soil contain much higher concentrations compared to, for example, feed or vegetation, and water. Water is a very weak vector of transfer because most of the POPs are hydrophobic, they are weakly soluble in the water. And moreover, vegetation, feed, and water, most of the time very strictly controlled by government by establishing maximum residuals levels compared to soil. Soil do not have any MRLs, maximum residuals levels, and therefore, based on these results, we would recommend to establish MRLs for agricultural soil to guarantee production of safety food products of animal origin and even food of plant origin. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Farida, for that great presentation. And now, just for the people who are new in the room, we have Mr. Roland Weber of the International Panel on Chemical Pollution, an independent consultant on POPs from Germany, talking about results of the global review of dioxins and PCBs in eggs. Thank you very much, Roland.
Yes, thank you, Lee. Thank you, Farida. Maybe one addition. Several countries have limits for dioxins in soil. Yeah, but what we have found out is, for example, that the limits what we have globally is not protective for chickens. So my presentation will be on dioxins and dioxin-like PCBs entering the food chain and the need for low pop content and unintentional trace limits for fertilizers and biosolids. So it is mainly around our review article on dioxin PCBs in eggs. So therefore, we have here the whole team of IPEN which supported the last 20 years these dioxin in egg studies. So free-range eggs are sensitive indicators for dioxins and PCB contamination in soils. And eggs are an important exposure pathway from this polluted soil to humans. So therefore, chicken and eggs are kind of the ideal active samples and indicator species for dioxins and PCBs in contaminated soils. And since the beginning of the Stockholm Convention, the IPEN team has monitored eggs around priority unintentional pop sources listed in the Stockholm Convention, including waste incinerators, metal industries, chemical industries, cement plants, e-waste recycling sites, dump sites, and other open burning sites also. And last year, I supported IPEN in this review article. It has open access. I recommend you to have a look at, to download it. So over these 20 years, IPEN monitored in total 113 chicken flocks at potential dioxin and PCB contaminated sites, and they found that 88% of these pooled eggs samples were above the EU maximum limits for dioxins, which is 2.5 picogram dioxin TEQ per gram fed, or the sum of dioxin and dioxin-like PCBs, which was 5 picogram dioxin and PCB TEQ per gram fed. So if a child consumes just one egg, it would exceed the FAO WHO TDI of 70 picogram TEQ per kilogram per month. So this means that if the egg exceeds the limit, it also exceeds the tolerable daily intake for a child. So this indicates that close to 90% of the areas where you have sampled your eggs were unfit for having chicken and eggs and for consumption of free-range eggs. And 14% of the eggs, 16 out of the 113 eggs, were contaminated above 50 picogram of dioxin and PCB TEQ and exceeded therefore the EU regulatory limit for more than 10 times. So people regularly consuming such eggs will have high dioxin body burden. We had one study in Germany in the 1990s where we had one city which was contaminated by a chloralkali, residues from chloralkali plant operating since more than 100 years. And there the people had consuming eggs had up to 93 picogram TEQ per gram fed of dioxins in their blood, so quite elevated, and the main source here were via the egg consumption they produced. For the highest egg, contaminated egg in the study of IPEN, this was from Ghana, in Agbogoshi, at the e-waste recycling site. The total TEQ in that egg was more than 1,100 picogram TEQ with around 600 dioxins, chlorinated dioxins, but then also PCBs and brominated dioxins. So just one egg is enough for a child to get the tolerable intake of 230 days for WHO FAO, or when you take the EU tolerable weekly intake, one egg is enough for 5 years, tolerable weekly intake of the European Union at this site. In this presentation, I want to focus only on one sector, that's the waste incinerator sector, and in respect to the low pop content. So IPEN sampled 26 eggs or pooled eggs around waste incinerators globally, and 24 of them, this means more than 92% around waste incinerators in 12 countries, including Cameroon, China, Czech Republic, Gabon, Ghana, India, Indonesia, Kenya, Moldova, Philippines, Slovakia, and Turkey exceeded the EU limit with a mean value of 43 picogram TEQ. This means nearly 10 times the levels of the EU regulation. And the highest level were found in eggs in Indonesia. Plastic waste were used as fuel for tofu boilers. So here the eggs had 234 and 172 picogram TEQ per gram fed. And also in Indonesia, again, at plastic waste combustion in a lime kiln, here the eggs had 212 and 119 picogram. This means these eggs were around 50 times or 40 times above the EU regulatory limits. And first, this highlights that co-incineration of plastic waste in non-BAT facilities result in high environmental contamination. And this is happening in all developing countries. Yeah, we are evaluating kind of what happens with plastic recycling there. And those plastic which cannot be recycled often go in this kind of small facilities. But also, when we looked at these free-range chicken eggs, at those locations, they had access to ashes, and IPEN also measured the ashes there. And the levels of the ashes were between 120 and 1,300 nanogram TEQ per kilogram. This means that these ashes were 10 to 100 times below the Basel provisional low pop content of 15,000. But at the same time, chickens which were impacted from this ash, yeah, and they are not only running on this ash, yeah. So this ash only had a part of the aerial, yeah. So they were 40 times above the EU regulation. Similarly, here for two hospital waste incinerators, one in the Philippines. So here the eggs around the incinerator had 66 picogram TEQ per gram fed, and in Ghana, the chicken egg had more than 63 picogram TEQ per gram fed. And also here, there were some remaining ashes and fly ashes. So here also the ash had 515 nanogram TEQ per kilogram. So this ash is also about 30 times below the current provisional low pop content. However, the eggs from chicken were 30 times above the regulatory limit. Yeah, so here you see that it's not a low pop content, but so-called low pop content of 15,000 is for sure not protective. When we look now to this transfer, what you just said, so we can calculate that if a chicken have a daily uptake of 25 picogram dioxins per day or 50 picogram TEQ of dioxins and PCB per day, then the egg is finally above the EU regulation. And with this amount of intake, we can compare with the soil concentration. And for this, we also need to know how much soil a chicken takes up per day. So a chicken in 10 to 30 gram, yeah. Yeah, it depends how long it's outside, and yeah. So, and then we know the carryover for the tetra and penta. So this is between 40 to 50%, and from this we can calculate the soil level at which a chicken comes above the EU regulatory limit, and at the same time the egg goes above the total daily intake for a child. So, and this is approximately 3 to 7 nanogram TEQ for the sum of dioxins and PCBs. And this problematic soil level is extremely low and is exceeded in many areas where you had industrial emissions, and can also be exceeded in cities and residential areas. So this explains why 90% of your eggs were above, because probably the soil had more than this 3 to 7 nanogram per kilogram. And also in the Netherlands, they have assessed 60 chicken herds around residential areas. And more than 50 of these chicken herds were also above the regulatory limit. Because in the past also we had wood heating, yeah, or coal heating, yeah, and then you put the ash in the garden, and so from these 50 years ago, maybe in Netherlands, yeah, still these areas are contaminated and the eggs above the limit. So therefore, the current provisional low POP limit established by the Basel Convention of 15,000 nanogram TEQ per kilogram is orders of magnitude too high for residues and needs to be re-evaluated and lowered if it should be protective for the use. And it's not only chicken. So for the German government, we had a research also on PCB transfer from environment to beef, because we had in some areas some challenges. And also there we found that at 5 nanogram TEQ of PCBs in the soil, the meat of the beef, especially from suckling cattle herds, this means that the calf get milk from the mother, is already above limit if we have 5 nanogram TEQ in the soil. And the same is true when you look to also here with 5 nanogram TEQ per kilogram in the soil, it is a problem for the tolerable daily intake. Yeah, it is not a problem for the regulatory limit. The regulatory limit for milk is a bit higher. Yeah, but when you look to the tolerable daily intake, also the cow which gives milk should not graze on an area which has more than 5 nanogram TEQ. And therefore, the German government in 2019, they made an update of the fertilizer regulation, including biosolids and also ashes from biomass. And here, Germany decided that fertilizers should have less than 8 nanogram TEQ per kilogram if this kind of fertilizer or biomass is brought on pasture land and for production and feed and farmland without blowing, or if it is blowing, then it can have 30 nanogram TEQ per kilogram. Yeah, but also there you see it's a way orders of magnitude lower than the Basel low content. And so therefore I see the risk that this low POP content of 15,000 nanogram TEQ can mislead authorities in managing ashes and waste, because when they hear, okay, it's less than the low POP content, maybe they think, okay, not too big problem. And also I have looked up how these 15,000 nanogram TEQ were then derived. And this was 2005 by BPRO, and it was derived by wrong assumptions. What is this? Okay. Okay. We can. Yes, I can go back. Yeah. Yes. And in addition, before I explain how this low POP content was derived, I also would like to highlight that there is a need of science-based unintentional trace limits, because at the moment on the international level, we are only talking about the low POP content of waste. But actually what we need is low POP content for products. And this is this unintentional trace limits for dioxins, PCBs, but also PFOS and PFOA, and therefore Germany set here this limit. It's not, but I see it then here. Yeah. So when you look, BPRO has assumed in their how they derived the low POP limit. So they looked first also to eggs. So that's interesting. And then they assumed that egg with 30 picogram TEQ is still acceptable for consumption. But that's actually not true. So already for 4 picogram, we are the TDI for a child. Yeah. So therefore here they were too high for a factor of 10. And then they assumed that an egg with a 30 picogram comes from a chicken which is grazing on soil which has 1,000 nanogram. So they said 1,000 nanogram in a soil, result that the egg has 30 picogram TEQ. So that was more wrong, because if you have a chicken on a soil with 1,000 picogram, the egg would have 800 picogram. So here they were wrong by a factor of 30. So therefore, overall, how BPRO derived 15,000 nanogram TEQ, they had a factor of 250 wrong. Yeah, and this was 2005. Yeah, and there is a study from the Swedish government, yeah, from 2011. So I have also put the references, which described, I mean, how, yeah, on this flaw. Yeah, and I think so that's important to know that how this was derived was wrong. Yeah. Last slide. So this IPEN review, at the end we made a recommendation, and this also includes the recommendation for industrial emissions and for low pop content, but there are many other recommendations, so therefore my recommendation to you to have a look at this review article. It's quite an interesting one. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Roland. A very revealing study into why we need much lower low pop content levels, particularly for dioxin. And now I'll just hand over to our final speaker, Mr. Serge Molly. Hello, former president of the Rotterdam Convention and vice president of the Minamata Convention, and this evening representing the regional centre from Dakar, the CRCB-AF. Thank you very much, Serge.
Thank you, Bill. My presentation for this evening is not outcome from a research institute. It will be a position from the African region after regional consultation about the low pop content. That will be, there are some questions I want to answer, that it is not in the same way my previous presenter. Okay, thank you. We have 4 questions in the region. What is the African group position on low pop content level? What is important for African to have strict limits for POPs? What is the impact on those importation of waste on trade to Africa? The first thing is that the low pop content definition, as you know, determine which waste will be considered waste and which will not. But as you know, in the Stockholm Convention, you have the issue of low pop content on Article 6. That is why we discuss for this issue. Okay, for the first question, what is the African group's position on low pop contents? The African region support and welcome the idea of establishing low pops content limits in ways to protect human health and the environment from the harmful chemicals. Our comments are specific to Section 3/A of the General Technical Guideline of Basel Convention on proposal for provisional definition of low pop content in waste for each pollutant listed under the Stockholm Convention. The second question, what is the importance of Africa to have strict limit for POPs in waste? The Africa region want to ensure that the lowest possible limit be established to ensure minimal no effect posed by such waste to its population and the environment. The region is mindful and concerned that demonstrate serious health problems such as endocrine disrupting chemicals with very minimal concentration. We are also taking into consideration the complexity of anthropogenic source of POPs in environment. The next question, yes, it's the same, but in the precautionary principle, the Africa region is proposed the following low POPs value. You can see, I believe that Gendrik made the first presentation on this table. We believe in this level is something we can adopt to save health and environment in the region. What is the impact of POPs waste on people living in Africa and other developing countries? The African and other developing countries are concerned with the detrimental effect that POPs may pose to the health of its vulnerable communities, particularly women and children. As you know, POPs is something with endocrine disrupting problem. cancer, neurodevelopmental disorder, and others. The last question is, does the importation of waste with POPs pose and treat to Africa? We can say yes. POPs waste, article and product containing or contaminated pose a significant risk to human health and the environment. For this reason, it is important for the region to emphasize the importance of adopting the precautionary principle to ensure that waste do not pose a risk to humans and the environment. Then my conclusion, recognizing that most endocrine disruptor and taking into account the variety and complexity of anthropogenic sources, the African region supports the stringent and protective. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Protective low POPs content waste. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serge. I think that the whole panel deserves another round of applause for a very interesting scientific presentation. Thank you very much. And now we do have some time left to take some questions from the audience and potentially from our online audience as well. I'll keep an eye out for that. But is there anybody who has a question for one of our panelists this evening? Yes. I'll come over to you next. Yes.
My name is Leen Tange. I was the founder from Polystyrene Loop, and I'm strongly supporting work that IPEN is doing. I do not agree with all the activities, but one of the things that I'm missing is the following. I founded Polystyrene Loop to handle HBCD containing waste, and we have about 200,000 tons in Europe present. And total appearing every year, and totally 20 million tons is between the cavity and the houses of the walls. This material is containing waste because it contains more than 5,000 ppm. My objective was to capture 3,000 tons out of the 200,000 tons per year. And later on, in the pledge with the Plastic Alliance in Europe, a pledge for building another big plant for 20,000 tons. Do you know what is my main challenge? To get the waste. And it's not because the POP limit is 7,000 ppm or 5,000 or 1,000. But the simple reason that there is no enforcement, everything is disappearing. So we have 200,000 tons. The incineration cost in Germany is around 400 euro rounds. Something like that.
Yeah, it can be and 200, depends, yeah.
Yeah, I could not get hold on the waste simply because it is mixed illegally. And I was asking German authorities, Belgian authorities, the Dutch authorities, how many samples did you take? None. So we are working here, legislation, and if it's not enforced, then if it's 1,000 ppm, for me 3,000 ppm for HBCD would be excellent. And if it would be enforced, then my plant would be flooded with waste, but it's not. So somewhere between what we wish and what is the real world, there is a big difference. How could you help me with that?
I think I'm trying to help you already because I represent IPEN on European Union authorities meetings. And I always ask what is the concern and why there are missing data about the amount of POPs in wastes. And the problem is that it's like throwing stones on the wall, I must say. So, but we as NGOs try to do our best and push authorities to take the control and to measure POPs in wastes.
Do you have any objective for yourself? How many % of the waste you would like to capture with a low POP limit concentration? Because I was trying to do that with the plant. And I was not really successful, not enough compared to the 200,000 tons, because finally our aim is to make our place safe and to destroy the POPs as it is in the final basis of our Basel POP Convention.
I think the best way will be, of course, to capture majority of POPs in waste, but you are right that there needs to be enforcement by the authorities and by the control mechanisms within the countries. We succeeded at least in, it was not the case of HBCD waste, but it was case of dioxins in waste. We succeeded in removing some waste above current low POPs content level from mixing that with other waste and using in proper way. So there are some results. The problem is that there is still not enough, and it needs more measures and more pressure also at EU competent authorities. And as far as I know, your industry associations are present at these meetings as well. And I must say, I never heard any pressure from the industrial side in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I did see a hand raised over here. If you'd like to ask a question, thank you. I'm sorry, we had difficulty hearing that. There's a microphone here if you would like to come closer. Sorry.
Just, need to know which physical.
I mean, these are the sources: metal industries, incinerators. So you form the dioxin in the incinerator and in the metal plant, and then you evaporate them in the air, and it settles down the next few hundred meters up to kilometers. Yeah, so they are not formed in the soil. Yeah, they are formed in the facilities, and they are emitted there. And over the years and decades, they are accumulating. Actually, also in Switzerland, they have found it out the last years, where they found in Lausanne very high dioxin levels in gardens. And finally, they found out this was from the waste incinerator operating in the 60s and 70s with very high emission levels. So this is the source of the contamination. Yeah, emission sources from industry or from open burning. Yeah. You can also have pesticides. I mean, in the past, pentachlorophenol has been used, which were contaminated with dioxins. In some countries, like Japan, you have used pentachlorophenol then for rice production. So therefore, the rice fields are contaminated. Yeah, also from this pesticide application, of course, 2,4,5-T, 2,4-D. In the past also could have high dioxin levels. So also you can have dioxin contamination in agriculture if these pesticides containing dioxin have been applied in the past. Another source.
Very significant source can be using of the residues from these industries, the ashes, especially if it is suggested to use it as a fertilizer or soil amendment. It's a very dangerous practice. And I read recently that it was suggested by the management of the waste incinerator in one African country. So this is really bad practice, which is based on the experience from very past that the ash was used as amendment to soil, but this definitely doesn't apply to waste incinerators or metallurgical facilities.
In recent years, we had a similar problem with PFOS, PFOA, and PFAS. In Germany, we have an agricultural area of 1,000 hectares contaminated from a paper factory which have used PFAS in the production of specific papers, and they gave this sludge then to a compost plant, and the compost plant gave it to farmers. And also in China you have the same. There are some agricultural areas which have quite high levels of PFAS than in the plants. So this is quite similar and is very much on the residues. So here from all PFAS industries, the residues need to really be managed appropriately. There's an estimate that we have 50,000 PFAS contaminated sites in the United States, and we have 40,000 PFAS contaminated sites in Europe. Yeah, from different kind of applications and industrial emissions and firefighting foams. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. If you'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, mine is not a question, it is a comment. In fact, the studies presented here, it undermines the importance of, soil as an important exposure pathway for food chain. Food chain, how it accumulates, especially the chicken and eggs. In fact, in some of the countries, especially in India, the incinerator ash, it is, the hazardous properties of incinerator ash, it is classified based upon the leachability test. So probably if you apply these findings here, then probably the assumptions made based upon the leachability test may be proved to be wrong. Moreover, we do not have any monitoring program of soils especially. UNEP also global monitoring plan mainly monitors POPs in air as well as human milk and not on soils. Maybe at least in the waste in soils nearby waste incineration site as well as waste disposal sites need to be monitored, and more such studies are required to throw more light on the enrichment of POPs in food chain. So that will help us to assess the real assessment of the toxic POPs accumulating in the food chain, and that will be a real risk assessment. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll just take one comment that I have that's come in from online from Elam from Egypt. Their comment is that we want a decision taken at the COPs basically to stop sending plastic waste with high concentrations of persistent organic pollutants to Africa and to Arab countries because plastics are acting as a vector for these persistent organic pollutants, particularly when there's management issues when they reach those countries as well. In some ways they've been described, such as the Indonesian situation with Tripod using them for fuels and other purposes. So I think that's quite a relevant comment. Would you like to say something as well, Jendrik?
Yeah, I would like to react on the previous intervention regarding the leachate tests for waste incineration residues. You are right, it's a very often approach, and I think it's one of the results when the low POPs content level for dioxin in waste was set up very high. So almost all waste incineration residues meet that low POPs content level. So the management and state the control institutions could be sure that almost none waste incineration ash will be above that limit value. And in fact, it was clear political decision which didn't have a base in scientific literature. So when I go through the scientific literature, you are right, mostly for the fly ash, even for fly ash from waste incinerators, is suggested to go with leachate tests for heavy metals, but it will not catch the potential harm caused by dioxin content, definitely.
Sorry.
Thank you for that elaborate and detailed presentations. For me, what I'd like, it's not a question, but rather to highlight something that is not necessarily discussed, the synergistic effects of endocrine disruptors it's another level altogether. But it's one thing that I think we need to bring to the fore of this discussion to show that our concern really is informed by science, because that alone is at another level in terms of the toxicity and things that can go far beyond of what we know when these endocrine disruptors are acting alone. Because once then they react together, the chemical reaction is totally different. And in most cases that I've noticed, it gets to be exponentially increased. So we need to take that into consideration in light of what is continually happening in our region, whereby waste is dumped illegally. And truly speaking, there's nothing that can be done. We report the convention we're having has got measures in place, but to effectively prevent that from happening, because in all these instances, it's been ongoing, it's getting worse and worse. It becomes the onus and the burden of the country where the waste was dumped illegally to have to take this back. There are no resources for that. Whilst they are trying to get the resources, the environment is negatively affected, pollution is happening. And as you know, what happens when you're exposed to such? People are sick. It's money that is diverted from other basic needs to something that ought not to be, because we're all parties to the BRS, and yet we continue to do these things. Thank you.
Thank you. Would any of the panelists like to comment there? That's okay.
It's fine. No statement.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, maybe one addition. I think tomorrow plastic report will be released, and many additives in plastic are endocrine disruptors. And there's a recent study from Kortenkamp about this kind of accumulating effects on the sperm quality. And you see that there are, I think, 29 chemicals or chemical groups which are known to have a negative impact here on the sperm quality. And then you can do what you said, this additive effect. Yeah, so I recommend to look to this Kortenkamp publication from 2022, which is quite impressive.
Thank you. And there's another hand up in the corner there. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I think I need some clarification on the first presenter. His opening statement, he mentioned the fly ash.
Yeah.
So I want to know whether the fly ash does not contain parts. Is that what you said, or you found out from your analysis? Or otherwise, please, I need clarification. Thank you.
I think I missed some words in the middle, so can you repeat in the question once?
The question is, in the opening statement, you mentioned fly ash. So, but you were saying that the fly ash has weak POPs content or it does not contain POPs. So I want to know, I need clarification. Are you trying to assert that fly ash is free of POPs and can be used in the construction industry?
No, it's misunderstanding. That's what we found out in the literature, that it was, or it is often suggested to be used as a construction material. And it is based on very high level of low POPs content, as it was set in the European Union, for example. So the waste incineration industry could be sure that in most of cases, fly ash from municipal waste incinerators, for example, would not be above the low POPs content level. So they could suggest to use it for construction materials such as cement, or for building sidewalks and so on. And it was based on very weak limit value for low POPs content levels. So I didn't say it's free of dioxin. It's definitely full of dioxins, and it needs to be better regulated, and it needs also more strict low POPs content level in order to push for better control of this waste flow. What we found out is that it is left out of the control and it means that we don't have control over more than 7 kilograms dioxin in these wastes globally every year. So, and that's what I said is equal to daily tolerable intakes for population of 133 planets Earth.
Thank you very much. I think we're getting close to time for this side event. Is there any other questions from the audience? There's one over here. Yes, thank you.
Yadira from Ecuador. I would like to know how much the one study that you present cost. How much does the studies that you present cost?
The cost of
Cost.
Yeah, how much the studies costs. So it depends on what you measure. So if we measure dioxins, for example, one sample analysis is about 400 euros per the analysis for dioxins and dioxin like PCBs. It's probably the cheapest option within European laboratories. And for brominated flame retardants, it's cheaper. So, and then it depends on how many samples you also have and so on. So it's not cheap, but it's reachable. And with regards the analysis, if you want to get some idea for cheaper analysis for dioxins, then it's definitely good to go with bioassay analysis, which gives you some idea about the dioxin activity of the sample. It costs about 170 euros per sample.
Yeah, this is just one comment. The cost of inaction will be much more than this cost.
Yes, the cost of inaction is indeed more expensive by many, many fold. And I think that's been demonstrated over a long period of time. I just have one very last comment that's come in online from the same commenter before, who asked that, do you think that IPEN and the African region might succeed to convince all parties to approve a much lower low pop content level at this COP? I don't think any of us know the answer to that, but I'd certainly like to think the answer is yes. And we're certainly trying to bring greater awareness to the issue. I don't know, perhaps Serge, if you'd like to make a comment, or are you happy? Yeah.
You want to make a comment?
That's
But our expectation is to have a good outcome during this meeting.
excellent diplomatic comment. Thank you very, very much for that, Serge. And I'd just like to thank all of the panelists here today and the IT support and our online audience for what I think was a very informative side event. So thank you all very much and good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Really interesting presentation.
Merci de votre soutien.
Thank you. Thank you, Serge. Yes, no problem. No problem. Return the device for its